Hi, everyone. This is Samantha Rosehill, and welcome to the Origins of Totalitarianism. This week, we are going to be talking about Chapter 9, the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. And since we are going to be transitioning to the final book next week, I'm also going to do a bit of work to tie some of the threads together today, and to talk about those elements of totalitarianism, those elements that crystallize in the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism. And then next week, we will talk about totalitarianism, a classless society, the totalitarian movement, totalitarianism, and power. And in these chapters, Arendt's going to give us her definition of totalitarianism as a radically new form of government. She's going to describe the process of radical evil, which is what she is in part setting up here in what we are going to talk about today in the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. And she's going to talk about propaganda and the ways in which mass movements are organized. And then in the final week, we will talk about the multiple ends that Arendt wrote for Origins over the years. There are 4 different conclusions. They're all very different from one another. And we will talk about ideology and terror, which was added to the book in 1958 and probably appears as the final chapter in totalitarianism in the volume that you have. So that's where we're at. This week, I want to talk about rights. We'll talk about home and homelessness, rootlessness, and we are going to take a look at some of the, I'm going to show you a little bit of the secondary work around the rights of man, because this phrase, the right to have rights, which is going to come out of this chapter, is probably one of the most critically analyzed phrases that appears in all of Origins. So Arendt is going to be engaging with the idea of rights and human rights. But a couple of words first, and then I have some nice things to share with you. So up until this point, we have been talking about the transformation of the nation state and the transformation of the nation state to an imperial nation that required the military apparatus in order to engage in the practice of expansionism and imperialism and colonialism. And so here, Arendt is going to be taking a look at a different side of the nation state while still talking about the decline or the collapse of the nation state. And she wants to draw into question the relationship between rights and sovereignty, or rights and the nation state. So there are only 3 sections in this chapter. We have the opening, the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. And then we have 2 sections, the nation of minorities and the stateless people, and the perplexities of the rights of man. I'm going to mostly focus on the perplexities of the rights of man. So Arendt is, so this section of Origins, like several of the previous sections we discussed, was initially, a version of it was initially published in 1948. So about 3 years before Origins was published. And it was published under the title, The Rights of Man, what are they? And that was published in response to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. At the heart of Arendt's argument is going to be a paradox, what she's calling a paradox. And it's the paradox that declares, that requires states to protect universal human rights for all individual human beings. And the fact that the nation state, that the modern institutions of the nation state are grounded on the principle of national sovereignty. So it's a contradiction between a notion of individual sovereignty and national sovereignty, between the particular and the universal, between these two warring definitions of sovereignty. I know that we've talked a little bit about Hobbes when we were talking about imperialism. Arendt goes to Hobbes to find a philosophy of power and expansionism that justifies the bourgeois mentality. And here, when she's engaging with this idea of the institution of the rights of man, she's kind of turning Rousseau upside down a bit. And if you have read The Social Contract, you might hear those first sentences. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And so here the institution of universal human rights says man is born free and remains free. Every individual has unalienable human rights. So for Arendt, she is going to try and find a way to repair is not quite the right word, and neither is resolved. And it's not quite that she's trying to find a way around. I think she's reaching back for another principle before one argues for universal human rights. And she says that we need another principle before the institution of rights in order to actually guarantee rights. And that is the right to have rights. That's where she's going to take this. So within the tradition of Western political philosophy, sovereignty and recognition, and so I've come to think of them personally almost as kind of two twin obsessions of political theory and contemporary political philosophy. What is individual sovereignty, and what does it mean to recognize the humanity or rights of individuals? And what is the relationship between an individual's right to and the nation's rights, which are also grounded in a notion of sovereignty? So let me just put that another way so that it clicks with what we've been talking about. I think I mentioned Sheldon Woolen's distinction between politics and the political. Both of those concepts are also about the exercise of rights and political action and sovereignty. So the political is the institution of sovereignty. So if you think with Rousseau, we submit our individual will to the general will, and that collection of individual wills then becomes the sovereign will. Hobbes, which is going to be more important for the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens in 1789. Let me let Joan in. Whereas Hobbes says we submit our individual will to the state in exchange for peace, for protection. So within the Western tradition, there's an understanding that we submit in some way our individual will to the state, either in this Rousseauian sense of what we would call popular sovereignty or democracy, or in the sense that we are citizens of the crown, which in America we're not. Okay, so we can come back to any of this. I'm just trying to give a little bit of background for those who haven't studied political theory. For Arendt, the rights of man, the rights of human beings, is going to be rooted in the rise of the nation state. And this, another way of saying that is that she's going to argue that rights are always instrumental to the nation state. So rights are rooted in the rise of the nation state. So then as the nation state starts to fall apart, which is where we're going, rights disintegrate. So for her, this means that the project of trying to somehow institutionalize universal human rights is in itself inherently flawed. Because as long as rights remain bound up in and rooted in the nation, which presupposes a claim to sovereignty, individuals themselves will be denied or can be denied their own individual sovereignty. Sovereignty is the notion of self-authority when we're talking about the individual. And when we're talking about the state, we're often talking about the state's right to exercise power. Arendt's also going to draw our attention to the abstraction of universal human rights. All, all men are created equal. What does that mean? All human beings are equal. What's a human being? What is equality? What is it that one is actually claiming when one makes this kind of claim? So there's a question of authority here as well. What is the authority of the state? What is the authority of the law? And what is the authority of the individual? So inalienable human rights, in the Rousseauian sense, can only be guaranteed within the collective right to self-governance, to popular sovereignty. So, and that is bound up with a state, with a nation, with a territory, with a place of being. Okay. I'm gonna pull up the text and pause here for a second. Okay. Can everyone see?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. The Declaration of the Rights of Man at the end of the 18th century was a turning point in history. It meant nothing more nor less than that from then on man, and not God's command or the customs of history, should be the source of the law. So humans, not the divine authority, the divine right of kings. Independent of the privileges which history has bestowed upon certain strata of society or certain nations, the Declaration indicated man's emancipation from all tutelage and announced that he had now come of age. I just want to stop here for a second and draw your attention to the fact that Arendt is writing most of this chapter in this tone, right? This is an incredibly sardonic tone. Mm-hmm. She's being rather critical. It's hard. I feel like half of teaching Arendt or talking about Arendt is always just saying, hear her, because it can be easy to slide over this. I'm going to go to the next highlighted paragraph and then we'll take it down. She says, since the rights of man were proclaimed to be inalienable, irreducible to and undeducible from other rights or laws, no authority was invoked for their establishment. Okay, so we got rid of God. We got rid of the divine right of kings. We got rid of any sort of transcendental authority. Man has made himself ruler of all. And now man has declared that man has inalienable, irreducible rights. And Aaron is asking, from whom? Where do they come from? What source of authority are these rights conferred by? Are rights a goal in themselves? And then you can hear Rousseau, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Okay. Do we have to, what is it that what tutelage is it that we are now freeing ourselves from? No special law, moreover, was deemed necessary to protect them because all laws were supposed to rest upon them. Man appeared as the only sovereign in matters of law, as the people was proclaimed the only sovereign in matters of government. The people's sovereignty, different from that of the prince, was not proclaimed by the grace of God, but in the name of man, so that it seemed only natural that the inalienable rights of man would find their guarantee and become an inalienable part of the right of the people to sovereign self-government. In other words, man had hardly appeared as a completely emancipated, completely isolated being who carried his dignity within himself without reference to some larger encompassing order when he disappeared again into a member of the people. From the beginning, the paradox involved in the declaration of the inalienable human rights was that it reckoned with an abstract human being who seemed to exist nowhere, for even savages lived in some kind of social order. Okay, so I'll stop there for a second. Why was it necessary for man to proclaim that he was free? If one is free, why must one proclaim their freedom? Mm-hmm. This is another side of this paradox. Okay, so we have three kind of problems that she's laid out. So we have the fact, as Arendt's claiming it, that the Universal Declaration is an abstract idea about humanity, and that there is no guarantee for human rights outside of extant political institutions. The second is that we have this tension between the individual's claim on self-sovereignty and the universal sovereignty of the state, which requires in some way the submission of the individual or the consent to be ruled, as we might put it. The third problem is that there's no source of authority beyond, I want to say, the hand that penned the line, right? There's no source of authority beyond man himself. What is the ground that guarantees the protection of human rights for all human beings? What is the precondition that guarantees the protection, that ensures that all people are being treated equally? I think in some ways, I think it's absolutely fair to call Arendt a humanist here. I don't think that there's any way around that. She is very much going to be claiming that that ground is in our humanness. But we as human beings are only recognized if we exist within a political community. And so the right to have rights is going to be the right to exist to a political community, which is necessary in order to guarantee rights. What are the rights that we're actually talking about? The right to vote, the right to participate in politics, the right for recognition, the right to certain public goods and services, the right to have a passport that allows one to move from place to place. There is no source of guarantee. There's a wonderful short book called The Right to Have Rights, which takes apart this chapter through various essays. And Stephanie DeGoyer talks about how ultimately citizenship is a lottery in our world, right? We all appear somewhere by virtue of our birth, and we don't choose where we appear. We don't choose our citizenship. And I think Arendt is not trying to break rights away from the state. Arendt is trying to find a way to guarantee the right to belong to a political community that allows one to be recognized as a human being. It's a very political argument, in that sort of traditional sense. So in The Human Condition, she talks about how we need both the private realm of solitude, what I was talking about a little bit at the beginning of class. We all need the private realm of solitude where we can take off our hat and masks and disappear and be alone with ourselves, or be among the intimacy and companionship of our families. But we also need to appear in public before others, which is where we speak and act and are recognized as equals. The right to belong to a political community is the right to appear. There's a story in a book by Rancière, who's a French political theorist who was influenced by Arendt, that I think about when I read these passages. It's in a chapter called, I think, Politics and the Police. And he offers two examples of political protest, one which fails and one which is successful. And he talks about the serfs who, when the masters leave, they take up the instruments of their labor and wait to attack the masters when they return with violence. And the master simply raises the whip and they cower and go back to work. And he contrasts this with the story of the patricians and the plebeians, which he claims to take from Livy's History of Rome, but it's not actually in Livy, where the plebeians dress up in the garb of the patricians and go into the public sphere and imitate the speech acts of the patricians, who are then forced to recognize them linguistically as equals. That's what Arendt's talking about. The right to appear as an equal in the public sphere. The right to belong to a political community. I'm going to go back to the text. So beyond the legal status, Arendt is also going to talk about the existential importance of belonging to a political community. And all of this is setting up the three-part process of radical evil, which is the way in which totalitarianism in power is going to strip individuals systematically of their rights in order to reduce them to non-beings who no longer have access to appearance, right? So Arendt's going to talk about the holes of oblivion. And we'll talk about that in detail next week. But I want to take a look at some of the passages around the existential importance of rights and belonging. And it's just maybe a good place to say again that, throughout the book, and Arendt will tie it together at the end, that the three underlying conditions of totalitarianism are homelessness, rootlessness, and abandonment. And here we're talking about homelessness and rootlessness and abandonment, and the ways in which refugees and stateless peoples in particular are stripped of their humanity when they're denied belonging to a political community. So she says the rights of man, supposedly inalienable, proved to be unenforceable, even in countries whose constitutions were based upon them. Whenever people appeared who were no longer citizens of any sovereign state, to this fact, disturbing enough in itself, one must add the confusion created by the many recent attempts to frame a new Bill of Human Rights, which have demonstrated that no one seems able to define with any assurance what these general human rights, as distinguished from the rights of citizens, really are. Although everyone seems to agree that the plight of these people consists precisely in their loss of the rights of man, no one seems to know which rights they lost when they lost these human rights. Okay, again, the tone quite clear. And now she's going to talk about the losses. The first loss, which the rightless suffered, was the loss of their homes. And this meant the loss of the entire social texture into which they were born, and in which they established for themselves a distinct place in the world. So the German word for home, Heimat, is not a house, but it is belonging to a community. It is the ease of language. It is a sense of purpose and meaning. It's the way in which we build a life that we can live in where we are. And those are the losses of home that she's talking about here when she's describing the existential state of homelessness, where one cannot be fully recognized when they appear. And she says, this is not the first one. The second loss, which the rightless suffered, was the loss of government protection. And this did not imply just the loss of legal status in their own, but in all countries. Treaties of reciprocity and international agreements have woven a web around the earth that make it possible for the citizen of every country to take his legal status with him no matter where he goes. So that, for instance, a German citizen under the Nazi regime might not be able to enter a mixed marriage abroad because of the Nuremberg laws, yet whoever is no longer caught in it finds himself out of the legality altogether. Thus, during the last war, stateless people were invariably in a worse position than enemy aliens who were still indirectly protected. Just going to go on. I'm just going to point out a couple more key passages and then I'll pull down. She says, these last points are crucial. The fundamental deprivation of human rights. The fundamental deprivation of human rights is manifested first and above all in the deprivation of a place in the world, which makes opinions significant and actions effective. Something much more fundamental than freedom and justice, which are rights of citizens, is at stake when belonging to the community into which one is born is no longer a matter of course and not belonging no longer a matter of choice, or when one is placed in a situation where, unless he commits a crime, his treatment by others does not depend on what he does or does not do. We became aware of the existence of a right to have rights, and that means to live in a framework where one is judged by one's actions and opinions. Again, that's what Arendt is describing as who-ness in the human condition. The right to appear before others as an equal in the public sphere and be recognized and heard, and a right to belong to some kind of organized community. Only when millions of people emerged who had lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global political situation The trouble is that this calamity arose not from any lack of civilization, backwardness, or mere tyranny, but on the contrary, that it could not be repaired because there was no longer any uncivilized spots on Earth, because whether we like it or not, we have really started to live in one world. Only with a completely organized humanity could the loss of home and political status become identical with expulsion from humanity altogether. This is a really interesting argument, I think, that she's making here after World War I, that the world of nations and empires and territories becomes one world. And it's this expansionism of the nation state through imperialism and colonialism that creates this oneness. But what it also means is that rights then are not transferable, that when one is stripped of their rights in one place, one is expelled from humanity altogether by virtue of that. The idea of humanity in itself starts to take on the kind of philosophical weight of authority. So when we get to the universal rights of man, thinking about humanity and belonging to the world, the idea of humanity in itself becomes a kind of natural notion, like human nature. And for Arendt, let me go ahead and pull up a couple more passages. She says, after the rights of man were proclaimed for the first time, this new situation in which humanity has in effect assumed the role formerly ascribed to nature or history would mean in this context that the right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, should be guaranteed by humanity itself. Right? So in place of God, in place of that transcendental authority, in place of the universal sovereignty of the nation, or even the sovereignty of the individual, the idea of humanity in itself becomes the standard bearer, the authority for the right to have rights. And she says it is by no means certain whether this is possible. And then the next highlighted passage, she says, the crimes against human rights, which have become a speciality of totalitarian regimes, can always be justified by the pretext that right is equivalent to being good or useful for the whole, in distinction to its parts. Hitler's motto that right is what is good for the German people is only the vulgarized form of a conception of law, which can be found everywhere and which in practice will remain ineffectual only so long as older traditions that are still effective in the constitutions prevent this. So we still, of course, have a doctrine which is still legally undefined, like moral turpitude, which is used to expel unwanted elements from a state. So historically was used to target sex workers or queer people, and has now more recently been used for immigrants. But what it means is that somebody is not good for the community, right? So one's belonging or rights become dependent upon this judgment of whether or not they belong in the first place. Some people who are critical of Arendt's reading here will argue that the real problem is the state in itself, and that as long as rights remain bound up with the idea of the state, that they will always be in danger. I think there is a very real question about whether or not the right to have rights can ever effectively be enforced. And I think Arendt is touching on both the political and existential conditions of homelessness, which become essential to totalitarian propaganda. As we'll talk about next week, the way in which individuals are stripped of their legality, demonized, and the way in which homelessness and the threat of homelessness is used to target and terrorize individuals within a state are necessary for creating a state of total terror. I think it's also one of the reasons, more politically and practically, Arendt became an advocate for citizenship, and argued that citizenship in the United States should also be enshrined in the right to citizenship, if one has it or has been naturalized, should be absolutely enshrined in the Constitution, so that under no circumstances whatsoever can it be called into question when it becomes politically advantageous. This certainly feels relevant to our contemporary political situation in the United States right now, where we saw a green card holder be detained by the United States government. And if anybody read the New York Times last weekend, I'll share it when I post the session for today. Masha Gessen wrote about this section from Origins, actually, and the ways in which historically queer people were often targeted first as test cases to see what could be done with citizenship rights. And we see other aspects of this, I think, right now, too, looking at voting registration and whether or not somebody has a birth certificate or a social security card that matches their current ID as a standard to vote, and so on. I'm gonna stop in a second, but I want to show you two more things. So let me pull them up. So, so this is from a really beautiful little book that Dick Bernstein wrote. I think it was 2016, a couple of years before he passed away. And there he talks about why read Arendt now. And he has a section in here, which I recommend on this section of the book. And I thought we would just take a look at the synopsis, kind of a passage that he has. He was a great reader of Arendt, critical of her, and very also, constitutively engaged thinking with her. The status of being a stateless refugee raises difficult questions about the so-called rights of man, inalienable rights and human rights. Arendt speaks about perplexities because she wants to identify the issues that we have to think about. She felt that most people do not really want to think. They prefer to ignore difficult political issues or use cliches to cover them up and dismiss them. She points to troublesome perplexities about the very idea of human rights. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the American Proclamation of Inalienable Rights, both pronounced at the end of the 18th century, were significant positive turning points in history. It meant nothing more nor less than that from then on man, and not God's command or the customs of history, should be the source of law. And then he summarizes the paradox too. Rights ascribed to man, disconnected from concrete individuals and the state. So I will share that with you. And then I want to just come back to the existential idea of homelessness for a minute, which is really central to the origins of totalitarianism. And I think really also part of what makes this book enduringly relevant, because she's not, giving a history as we've talked about, but she's also, in looking at the elements that crystallize, she's trying to understand what changes for the individual, which I think is what Dick is pointing out there when he starts to talk about this section. How is it that we are thinking with this kind of situation? And what does it mean to think about making a home, being at home, and belonging in the world? When we want to talk about, very serious political things, I think sometimes, this is me and my political theory training, there's a kind of instinctive, move away from those larger existential questions. But for Arendt, those existential questions about belonging and home were really important for understanding why so many people went along with totalitarian movements. When people are desperate for meaning, when people feel homeless in the world, they become more susceptible, we could say, to political propaganda. But also she's pointing out the ways in which our very human vulnerability can be used to terrorize people in order to create an atmosphere of terror, which is central to the organization of totalitarian movements. When she gets to the definition of totalitarianism, she's going to argue that they rule by terror, so that even the people in the highest echelons of the Nazi Party live in a state of constant terror, of fearing that they too shall be cast out of the human community. Freedom for Arendt requires stable political institutions, but it also requires that individuals have the ability to move freely between a private life and a public life. And both of those notions, a private life and a public life, are two different sides of thinking about home, of having a space of solitude or a space where you can be with your family in a private home, and also a political community where you belong, which is another form of home. And under the conditions that she's subscribing, people are both forced to leave their physical homes, and people also lose that feeling of being at home in the world. That feeling of being uprooted, right? So there we have the homelessness and the rootlessness. We talked a little bit about her beautiful essay, We Refugees, where she talks about this in a much more kind of personal sense. But I want to say in the human condition, where she tries to answer this question more directly, the closest that she gets is through the idea of durability. And durability for her is a promise and a guarantee that the world is strong enough to endure. And she started thinking about the possibility of durability contrasted with the impermanence of human life and the impermanence of the institutions, which seem to be governed by economic principles of consumption and use, and so disappearance. When she was visiting the ruins in Syracuse, and she saw that it is possible for things to last or remain in the world. And I wanted to share with you, just because I have them, a poem, it's a short one that she wrote, where she's turning Nietzsche upside down. And I would say that a lot of the poems are actually also, the post-war poems are about durability and often reflecting on her travels to Europe after the war. And so she says, mournfulness is like a flame lit in the heart, darkness, a light that leads us through the night. We need only ignite our grief to find home in the long dark night like shadows. The forest is illuminated, the city, the street, and the trees. Blessed is he who has no home. He still sees it in his dreams. I'm going to stop there for this week. I just realized I forgot to put myself on spotlight. That's okay. How's everyone doing? Thoughts, reflections, questions? Yeah, Marilyn, please.
So I know that this work is based on the philosophy of political theory, political science. I can't help but think, I'm a psychoanalyst, psychologist, how she omits a lot of intrapsychic phenomena that can be influenced by the political system and the culture. And certainly in her time, Freud and his followers were very much, in people's awareness, probably more than now. And I just wonder, not that we're leaping from one system to the next. I do understand the system, that she doesn't talk at all, that I wonder if she does ever talk about how the intrapsychic structure can influence all of this, that is influenced by the political system. And I know generations of psychoanalysts and psychologists working from cognitive neuroscience have taken up this question about how all this could happen. So I just wonder, is it just that she's siloed in this one area, or did she ever consider the dynamics of the larger system?
No. She didn't. It's a great question. And I'm trying to remember, I think it's in a letter that she writes to Heinrich Blücher where she says that, she doesn't want anything to do with psychoanalysis. She's very allergic to that style of thinking. And she doesn't really talk about it. The only explanation that I can think of is that I think it's for her the idea of having just as the idea of a human nature, or Darwin's work on evolution, or Galilean dialectics become delimited frameworks for thinking that become predictive. She's concerned that the ego, the id, the unconsciousness, the universal unconsciousness, that these ideas are determined. And I don't think she's very clear in the human condition. She says the only thing that makes us equal is that we're not equal. And she really insisted on difference in her work. And I think any type of thinking that tried to that moved from an understanding of human nature, human being, she turned against. She really insisted on that distinction. I often joke that she originated the snowflake theory, but she really didn't. And she's also extremely European, and she's very much schooled in this tradition of Western European political philosophy. She is moving Augustine, who she read as a philosopher more than a theologian, Kant, Jasper's work on plurality. These are, I would say, probably, there are many influences, but those are three of the biggest for her.
Okay, I just wondered, and I do have respect for different systems, and sometimes it gets messy if you have too many theories. It's not like logical, but in my mind, having been exposed to a lot of other versions of this. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's
Thank you.
space for it. Um,
Yeah, somebody might want to write like a integration of her ideas and psychoanalytic psychology ideas with respect to the different systems of thought. Yeah.
in the class I'm teaching on loneliness right now, we talked a little bit about David Reisman, who
Mm-hmm.
she knew. And when we get to ideology and terror in the last week, I think we see even more of this, where they were corresponding. She read The Lonely Crowd and they corresponded about it. Um, and she wrote the section on ideology and terror and loneliness and mass psychology. I think you could say, or the political formation of mass movements. And I think that her work fits, really fits in that kind of immediate post-war social psychology work on crowds and the mass as well.
Mm-hmm.
So she was
Mm-hmm.
definitely engaged with them in conversation, but moving from a very different tradition of thinking.
Mm-hmm. I just would say one small contribution. I don't know if you know about Einstein's letter to Freud. They had a correspondence. It's online. He said, Professor Freud, why war? And
Uh,
then Freud wrote back and explained based on civilizationist discontents, a lot of it. So there was something in that. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Thank you.
anyway, thank you. That's helpful.
No, thank you. Hi, Chris.
Thank you. My first time asking a question here. I haven't been able
Welcome.
to go to all the sessions, so just family stuff going on. But I was really intrigued by your mention of Nietzsche, and I just have to tell you, I've been looking into Nietzsche's way of thinking about caste, the caste system in India,
Oh,
and some of his writings, and so much of what you're talking about seems like it's also in that vein. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about your comment that she's turning Nietzsche on his head.
well, can you say more about what you're thinking about with Nietzsche and the caste systems in India?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm very self-conscious about how many I've missed, so apologies if I'm missing this. But
No.
there's been some work going on about the ways he's thinking about the Uberman, and his opposition is with a Sanskrit word called chandal, which means untouchable, and so he takes it from a French translation of Laws of Manu, and so there's been a lot in, I guess, kind of German scholarship about this. I've been just touching on a little bit, but I just wonder what she's doing with Nietzsche, according to you. That is very, very intriguing to me.
Oh, I don't know much about what you're working on. But Arendt was very influenced by Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is really, she doesn't cite him very often, but much like Walter Benjamin, he is all over the pages of her work. Um, and I think you probably see it most explicitly in the life of the mind, in the sections on thinking and willing, where she does talk directly about Nietzsche, but it's also in the human condition as well. I think so. In the life of the mind, there's the section on willing, which for Arendt um, is Plato and Augustine and Paul, to Nietzsche, and it's all her argument about the will is a refutation of Heidegger's concept of being. And so I think she goes to Nietzsche in part for her understanding of personal moral responsibility, which she gets out of part, not totally out of Nietzsche, but I think he's an influence there in his notion of what it means to be responsible for giving style to oneself, as he says in Zarathustra. But I think in the poem that I read you, she's playing with Nietzsche's conception of metaphysical homelessness. So the fundamental questions of metaphysics, what is the meaning of being? And there's Nietzsche is in the gay science. There's a fragment, we who are homeless. And I put it in the footnote to the poem series, says, let me see if I can find it. We who are homeless. Among Europeans today, there is no lack of those who are entitled to call themselves homeless in a distinctive and an honorable sense. It is to them that I especially commend my secret wisdom and Gaia Scientia. So again, I think Nietzsche's tone also very important for Arendt in that sense as well. But there's this idea of let me just put it in there for you so you have it. Where did I send it? It is. Arendt is, I think also, this is just part of my reading of Willing, which is very much a critique of Heidegger, and where she also most explicitly engages with Heidegger's work. She is turning to Nietzsche and his idea of homelessness to critique Heidegger's conception of Gewohnheit, or thrownness, as well. And there's a note in one of her journals where she says, Heidegger says man is thrown into the world. No. If that's true, it would be very sad for man. So, and Nietzsche was central to Heidegger's work on thrownness as well. So she's using his sources in a way, and turning them around to refute him. Do a whole class on Nietzsche and Arendt. That would be really fun. I don't know if I'll ever have an excuse to do that.
Thank you. And one more thing, if I may, I don't know if it's in the chat. I have bad eyes, so I'm not good at following the chat, but I was also really intrigued related to that is that you said the word that's used in German for house or for home. If you put it into the chat, it seemed like, I don't know if you already did, but that was really interesting.
No, I didn't. I will. It's time out. And I'll just say, too, so when we talk about ideology and terror in the last week, the word, one of the most common passages I think that gets quoted from Origins is the underlying condition of all totalitarian movements is loneliness. And the word, she actually wrote ideology and terror in German initially. It's the only part of Origins she wrote in German. And she wrote it for Jasper's for a birthday celebration. And the word that she uses is Verlassenheit, which those of you have probably heard, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but it means verlassen is to abandon. But Arendt is taking that notion of Verlassenheit, abandonedness, from Nietzsche. And it's from the section in Thus Spoke Zarathustra titled Heimat, home, where Nietzsche draws a distinction between Einsamkeit and Verlassenheit. So Einsamkeit, usually the word we would use for loneliness or solitude. Nietzsche is going to talk about how that Einsamkeit is what we would think of as pleasurable solitude of keeping company with ourselves. And Verlassenheit, the feeling of abandonment, is what happens when we're in the world with others. So Zarathustra, he descends the mountain, he engages with other people, it's terrible, and then he goes back up and he escapes his
Run away.
Verlassenheit by returning to his solitude.
Mm.
So there we also, but we see it in Homecoming in the chapter, or maybe it's Heimkehr, sorry. It's Heimkehr is the title of that subsection in Zarathustra. It's the return home, to return home to oneself.
Hmm.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I just a thought, like when you talked about the plebeians and the patricians and the dressing up, I wondered if you had any thoughts about how that could be enacted now. I was thinking of the guy who is the owner of Pirates Booty on Long Island, the popcorn went into I think like I don't know, one of the government offices and declared himself mayor and started using arguments like Trump, like, I can't reveal the identities because they're, of my supporters, but they voted for, and he did this whole thing, but I'm just wondering, is there any way that could be, because I feel like I think of Sacha Baron Cohen and the movies he's done where he's impersonated people and it's fooled people and yet when they find out, he's in great physical danger, really. So, I just wonder if there's any way that might be used in some new, I don't know. It occurred to me.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't,
there are different ways.
it's as far as
I think I'm thinking of Billionaires for Bush. Back, political movement of people who would dress up in suits and go into board meetings and engage in disruption and protest. I mean, I think there are certainly opportunities for creative protest potential and the model that Rancière gives us. I think he's also emphasizing the importance of linguistic recognition and the ways in which we are intelligible to one another, and whether or not we can speak the right speak to gain admission. Yeah, Alexander.
Yeah, hi, thank you. And as I'm German, first, please excuse my bad English. I have, yeah, first of all, I'd like to remark that these discussions about the German words and the English translations, this is quite interesting because I'm reading the German version and some parts are different.
Yeah.
And this is something where I would like to hear a bit more about that. Because the German version is also newer than the original version and has more, she learned on the way before it was translated. And so there's something which we probably could say something more about, but maybe that's something of next week because the totalitarianism is the part which differs most, I think.
The part on totalitarianism. I can try when we get to it next week, I can maybe pull out some examples. So Arendt wrote Origins in English, and then she translated it into German. And I think there are less changes in Origins than there are in the human condition. But I would have to go back and look at it to see if there's to look for any other notable kind of translation examples. I don't have the German in front of me at the moment. I will say that, it's not very, Arendt is excuse me, always thinking in language. And she is, I think, she's not a monolinguistic thinker, and she stays very close to her mother tongue, even when she's writing in English. But when she rewrites Origins and rewrites the human condition, I think that she's a bit, it's a bit freer. So if there's a certain passage you want to look at, we can look at it.
No special one, just in general. There's one thing about today's chapter, the human rights. I find it quite interesting. The German constitution was written mostly at the same time as this book, and it looks a lot like they have read this chapter before writing the German constitution, because it's reflecting all these issues on human rights on all human beings and not only on citizens. And it's a very special part, but it's obviously learning from the same history. And one third thing, did we skip the chapter of the Pan movements, or did I miss it?
No, last week we didn't go over it in detail. Last week I invited somebody to join me to talk about Arendt's conception of the nation state and imperialism. But we can go back to it more if there's something specifically as well.
Yeah, it's not very special, but as a German, I found this chapter the most relatable to me, because it was what was part of this chapter is what I'm seeing every day here. And if I replace Jews with migrants, it's scary how identical this is, and how very well described history is repeating.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. In the section on the Pan movements, it's also related to what we were talking about today, and the ways in which people want to claim sovereign authority or a kind of status of exceptionalism for themselves as well. And so there's she's rooting the emergence of Nazism and Bolshevism into the Pan-Germanism and the Pan-Slavism movements historically, and thinking about the ways in which people make that claim of nationalism, which I think is part of what you're talking about, I assume referring to the rise of the AfD, or Make America Great for Americans Again, or the return to this kind of 19th century nation state logic. But what she really sees in the Pan movements that we didn't talk about explicitly last week, but what I think I mentioned in passing, is the relationship between movement and ideology, and the ways in which they become the kind of ways that this is what we're going to see in the section on totalitarianism and in ideology and terror. So totalitarian movements can only succeed if they can successfully organize the masses into a movement. So the movement then mirrors the expansionist logic of imperialism, which is mobilized by the ideology, which we get in the political propaganda. So in the pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism movements, we see this merger between the movement, the political movement, at the institutional level, and the ideology, which becomes the defining feature of the totalitarian regimes. And it's also central to her central argument that the rise of Nazism and Stalinism is actually the decline of the nation state instead of the rise of the nation state. So the pan movements weakened the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they weakened the state, and implemented more layers of bureaucracy. And they also led to the waves of refugees, which are also important to the successful functioning of the ideology, or the ideology is staked on the prejudices that are fed through the waves of refugees that are created through the pan movements. So their movement, the ideology, the decline of the political institutions, and the bureaucratic reorganization of the state. For her, these become the kind of structural influences that lead to Hitlerism and Stalinism, respectively. It's a very quick summary of the kind of key theoretical points. But yeah, I think we very much see a return to that rhetoric right now, and it's in Germany, especially, I would imagine after 2009, 2010, and Merkel, and the waves of immigrants and the rise of the AfD, that there is some historical parallel. Here, I think that the real question remains of what it's moving toward. We don't know what it's actually going to lead to. And that's a very scary question.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for asking.
I wanted to comment on, recently in a family group chat, we've been debating what's recently happened at the Department of Education. And it hasn't been the most friendly chat, as we have some Trump followers in that. But having recently read Between Past and Future and the section on the crisis in education, one of the things that kind of dawned on me here today with the right to have rights, and this notion of as you said early on, you said, to belong, the right to belong is the right to appear. And thinking about, can we think of education in a similar way with like natality, and that, educating young people to be able to appear in public and participate in this common world. It also seems so fascinating that once you start to change that status for people, whether it's women, by taking rights away, or even with children, with changing and altering that institution, it just seems like those parallels are fascinating, even with something as, seemingly benign right now. I mean, it's pretty catastrophic with the Department of Education. I have a daughter who's graduating high school this year. And so, but it also seems like a similar thing where, which seems like a moment where I'm kind of like, all of a sudden, this person as a student is potentially, in a weird, strange way, homeless in a way, as far as an institution that was once structured around that become a part of the common world. So just some thoughts about seeing those parallels.
Yeah, there's a really beautiful passage where Arendt says that education is the point at which we decide to take responsibility for the world. And for her, education was one of the primary, I think, means that we had to take responsibility for making the world that we live in together. Which, I mean, is, and I think she was in her notebook in the 1960s, she has a couple of pages on the destruction of the universities with the implementations of boards of trustees and the privatization of universities, and seeing universities beholden stockholders essentially instead of she was very much there was a different sense of what I think education was, which both gets her in the trouble and is also, I would say, admirable in the world that we live in today. In certain ways, where she really, in the essay on education, has an idea of what it means to hold a space for thinking together with, reading a text, and expanding the mind, to think in new ways, which is the opposite of ideology. I think unfortunately, the kind of move that we're seeing is not new at all. It's quite old, where I don't even know if it's, say, the right. It's not really even a traditional conservative movement, but the far right, even during the Cold War, wanted to censor what could and could not be taught. And we've been watching this unfold in the United States for a while. And if you go back and look at some of those texts from that, on, like, if you go through the archives on the Heritage Foundation website, have fun. There are, texts about, this is what I do when I can't sleep at night. There are, texts about, the need for an education agenda to put America first, to fight multiculturalism. Multiculturalism then was what's the word? A dog whistle for anyone who wasn't white, heterosexual, and Christian, and often meant people who were Jewish and Marxist as well, or considered to be coming from some sort of Marxist tradition. And so we've been watching that with the restrictions on curriculum in Florida and other places, and unfortunately, what they've done is successfully rhetorically turned turned it upside down, so that the people who argue for non-ideological thinking and free speech and are the enemies, and we need to actually safeguard people from those ideas. It's very ideological. And I think, unfortunately,
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Ideology. Yeah, sorry, Sean, go for it.
No, yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because when the executive order was given, there's certain governors on the stage that know much of school systems. And I was part of a campaign about 10 years ago to help promote going on to college in Idaho, actually. And we had this, kind of a teen-led effort there for that. And it was fascinating to see that even behind the scenes of some of these seemingly pro-education movements were still really based more on privatizing and kind of introducing more of that kind of corporate element, specifically to kind of support that ideological aspect, of course, in a state like Idaho. So on one level, they're saying something like charter schools, but what they're actually talking about are not public charter schools. They're talking about private charter schools with a very specific agenda that they wanted the state to fund. So it's a fascinating dynamic and struggle. But I love this idea of, the idea about taking responsibility for the world. And I think discussing rights too this week, because we talked a lot about the rights that were recently taken away by the Supreme Court, and rights is in quotes there, but it's still an important part of the debate to how one people or part of society could be decided to not be human, to kind of have a way of where their rights are stripped away because of that, and how that can be used. It's just fascinating to read it here in the way that, she articulates it. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. I was, after our meeting last week, I was talking with Susie, and I think we both, with a little bit of despair, to be honest, kind of, we're thinking about how in the United States, things are moving much faster than either one of us expected they would right now, is how it feels. And that we're going to hit the limit of that, what's being called a constitutional crisis much faster than we realized. I think it's Arendt's work, I think, is unfortunately still much more relevant than anyone would like it to be. Corey Robin, if you're familiar with his work, has also been writing about Origins and Arendt, specifically the relationship between those early passages on anti-Semitism we read, and why is it that the Jewish question remains so central to the organization of the new far right today. And Masha Gessen has been writing about rights and the way in which we're watching Trump test what he can do with citizenship and visas. So we will keep on here, though. I shall not end things in a tone of despair. Next week, we will talk about the elements of totalitarianism in particular. And I think Arendt is quite specific in offering a definition of totalitarianism. We'll go through those elements, those bullet points, and we will talk about radical evil, different from the banality of evil. And I'll say a little bit probably about the relationship between radical evil and the banality of evil, which doesn't come till 63. We are starting to move toward the end of the book, though, so I want to invite you to send questions or thoughts or anything that you want to talk about. And I've been also, I'll just say here, thinking about maybe what book to read next. I have some ideas, but if you have any wishes, you're welcome to send those to me too. I think I've really been enjoying these conversations. So thank you. And thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.